Alright, we spent a long time looking at the first generation characters in Wuthering Heights, so in today's episode I wanted to take a closer look at the second generation. In today's video we'll be doing analyses of Cathy Jr., the daughter of Edgar and Catherine, Hareton Earnshaw, the son of Hindley and Francis, and Linton Heathcliff, the son of Heathcliff and Isabella Linton. The aim of this video is really to get an understanding of how the second generation characters relate to the first generation of characters. In what ways are they similar to their parents, and in what ways are they different? And how do they embody some of the themes that we've talked about in earlier episodes of the series? Part 1. Hareton Earnshaw, the noble savage. Hareton is probably one of the most tragic figures in Wuthering Heights. He is the son of Hindley and Francis Earnshaw and the rightful heir of Wuthering Heights. That is, until his father Hindley gambles everything away to Heathcliff, and Heathcliff is able to take full ownership of the Heights. Hareton's early story arc mirrors Heathcliff's in many ways. Both of them initially have a decent-ish upbringing. Hareton is liked by Nellie and cared for by her, if not by his dad, but ultimately things start to go wrong. Once Hindley dies and Hareton is left in Heathcliff's care, Heathcliff is able to get his revenge by casting Hareton down to the position of a servant, which is exactly what happened to Heathcliff when he was a child. As Nellie tells us, in that manner Hareton, who should now be the first gentleman of the neighbourhood, was reduced to a state of complete dependence on his father's inveterate enemy, and lives in his own house as a servant, deprived of the advantage of wages, and quite unable to right himself because of his friendlessness and his ignorance that he has been wronged. Hareton only has a brief amount of care when he's a child, and most of this comes from Nellie, and none of it from his father Hindley. His mother Frances dies in childbirth, so she's certainly out of the picture. Hindley spirals into depression because of Frances's death, and basically takes out his depression and anger and frustration at the world on his son. At one point this leads to a very brutal scene in which Hindley threatens to dash Hareton's brains out on the floor, flay him alive, and break the brat's neck. So it's only from Nellie that Hareton gets much tender affection in those early years. But unfortunately, once Catherine marries Edgar, Nellie leaves Wuthering Heights, leaving Hareton in Hindley's care. And from this point on, Hareton's character changes. He turns from a quite nice young man into a wild little savage, very much similar to how Heathcliff and Catherine were when they were younger. Eventually, Hindley, after drinking himself into spirals and spirals of depression and gambling everything away to Heathcliff, dies. And this is the moment when Heathcliff gets to take his revenge by turning Hareton into a servant. Heathcliff even tells us that that is his intention. It's to make Hareton the exact same as him. Now, my bonny lad, you are mine. And we'll see if one tree won't go as crooked as another, with the same wind to twist it. But Hareton ultimately doesn't grow as crooked as Heathcliff. He marries Cathy, and at the end of the story seems to be on the verge of having a really nice life. So why is it that Hareton, who seems to mirror Heathcliff in his upbringing for most of the time, why is it that he is able to break the cycles of revenge and not become bitter and have that happy ending? In my opinion, I think that's because Heathcliff, despite his best intentions, fails to do to Hareton what was done to him. He actually shows him a little bit of care and affection, and it's this care and affection that Heathcliff shows to Hareton that stops him from going down the same dark path. Now, Hindley's relationship with Heathcliff is very much a background thing, but we can learn little bits about it from looking at the subtle ways in which they behave towards each other, and by listening to some of Nellie's remarks. At one point, Nellie tells us, Mr. Heathcliff, I believe, had not treated him physically ill. And Heathcliff himself suggests that he struggles to hate Hareton in the way that, say, Hindley hated Heathcliff when Heathcliff was younger. Do you know that, 20 times a day, I covet Hareton, with all his degradation. I'd have loved that lad had he been someone else. So from Nellie we learn that Heathcliff doesn't physically abuse Hareton, which is a big difference because we know that Heathcliff was physically abused as a child. And Heathcliff himself suggests that he struggles to hate Hareton, and try as he might, he seems to actually show affection towards him. Ultimately though, the biggest sign that Heathcliff can't have been that terrible to Hareton comes after Heathcliff's death, when we see how Hareton reacts to it. Hareton sat by the corpse all night, weeping in bitter earnest. He pressed its hand, and kissed the sarcastic, savage face that everyone else shrank from contemplating, and bemoaned him with that strong grief which springs naturally from a generous heart, though it be tough as tempered steel. All of this suggests to me that Heathcliff must have given Hareton some degree of kindness, even if he did take his property and his life from him. This is why Hareton doesn't become bitter and vengeful, and it's why ultimately when Heathcliff dies, he's genuinely saddened by it. Hareton doesn't care that he's lost property and all that. It doesn't matter to him. What he's lost, it seems, is a father, and he's really sad about that. The final thing to talk about with Hareton's character is his connection to Catherine Earnshaw. That's not Cathy Jr., that's Cathy Sr. We learn in the story that Heathcliff sees a connection between Catherine and Hareton, in a way that he doesn't see a connection between Catherine and her own daughter, Cathy. The first thing to note about this is that it seems that in the world of Wuthering Heights, biology doesn't really matter. It's a world where people's spirits seem to matter more. And a character like Hareton reminds Heathcliff of Catherine because Hareton has the same rugged roughness that Catherine had when she was a child. Whereas Cathy, who's very much a product of Thrushcross Grange, doesn't have that. And so when Heathcliff sees her, he just sees Edgar and civilization, all the things that Heathcliff and what he represents is against. And I think partly the reason why Heathcliff ultimately is a bit kind to Hareton is because of that connection. Because he sees Catherine in Hareton, he can't be fully cruel and evil with Hareton in the way that he can with Cathy. In a way then, Hareton is almost like a replacement Catherine for Heathcliff. Because unlike Catherine, who goes to the Grange, Hareton stays with Heathcliff at Wuthering Heights, at least until he falls in love with Cathy. But when Heathcliff realises this, he doesn't get all vengeful this time, he actually weakens and allows Hareton to live his life because he ultimately wants to be forgiven himself. I think ultimately what Hareton is what Catherine and Heathcliff might have been had they been able to control themselves a little bit better. Both Catherine and Heathcliff are just completely at the mercy of their emotions, and they're vengeful and violent people, and this is why they ultimately die. Hareton, he does have that roughness and wildness, but he's able to temper that, and that's why he's able to establish a meaningful relationship with Cathy at the end of the story. Ultimately then, I think Hareton just represents what Catherine and Heathcliff could have been had they had a little bit more self-control. Part 2, Cathy Linton. At the end of part 1, we noticed how Cathy and Catherine, her mother, don't really resemble each other all that much, and this is something that Nellie herself corroborates. A real beauty in the face, with the Earnshaws' handsome dark eyes, but the Lintons' fair skin and small features, and yellow curling hair. Her spirit was high, though not rough, and qualified by a heart sensitive and lively to excess in its affections. That capacity for intense attachments reminded me of her mother. Still, she did not resemble her, for she could be soft and mild as a dove, and she had a gentle voice and pensive expression. Her anger was never furious, her love never fierce. It was deep and tender. So in many ways, Cathy is much more a product of the civilised world of Thrushcross Grange than she is the wild world of Wuthering Heights. Although there are a couple of similarities with Catherine, Cathy is a bit spirited like her mother, everything is a little bit more refined and a little bit more in control. Another big difference between Cathy and her mother is that Cathy actually is the favourite of her father. Edgar dotes on Cathy and loves her very much, protecting her to the point where he actually keeps her inside, in the grounds of Thrushcross Grange for the first 13 years of her life. So Edgar is really protective and nurturing of Cathy, and this probably accounts for a lot of her softness. Whereas with Catherine, she wasn't the favourite even when her parents were alive, and so she's never really had that affection, especially not at an early age. Bronte makes an effort to point out how sheltered Cathy is in her early years. Till she reached the age of 13, she had not once been beyond the range of the park herself. Edgar does a lot of work to sever Cathy's connection to her mother and the world that she comes from. Because of this, Cathy is a little bit more naive than some of the other second generation characters, at least at first. In this way, she kind of mirrors the development of Isabella and Edgar. When we see those for the first time, they're inside Thrushcross Grange, sheltered from the rain and crying because they can't deal with anything problematic. Cathy also has the same development as Isabella and Edgar. She comes into contact with the violent and barbaric world of Wuthering Heights, and she has to try and survive in this world now. But unlike Isabella, who eventually runs away from it, and Edgar, who just hides from it and pretends it doesn't exist, Cathy is able to confront it head on, and ultimately she's the one who survives and lives a happy life. We can see both Cathy's naivety and also her bravery by looking at her relationship with Linton. Her naivety is shown in the fact that for most of the story, she's unable to see the dark, twisted side of Linton. She thinks that because he's weak and a little bit pathetic, that he's helpless and harmless, and that she's the one that can protect and help him. At one point, she even describes him as her little pet, which really shows you how much she's underestimating his character. Unfortunately, and I'll talk more about Linton in the next section, Linton manipulates Cathy quite a lot. He's able to use his weakness to make her dote on him even more. And Nellie sees through this, but Cathy really can't see it for a long time. And this is why ultimately she ends up marrying him, or part of the reason, and she ends up in a terrible situation. It's after this marriage that Cathy's naivety starts to break down. She's able to see Linton more for what he is, and she's able to confront Heathcliff and, as I've talked about in a previous video, defy him. But Cathy's deception by appearances does still continue after this fact. Just as she at first thought that Linton, because of his appearance, was a nice person, just a bit weak and pathetic, she's also deceived by Hareton's rough appearance, thinking that he's basically just the same as Heathcliff. And it's only when she sees the true Hareton underneath his appearance that she's able to develop as a character and have her happy ending. And it's in not being deceived by appearances that Cathy makes her break with Edgar and his side of things. Edgar, for his whole character arc, always sees Heathcliff as nothing but a working class servant who shouldn't be associated with. Cathy has this inside her too, because she treats Hareton, who is a mirror of Heathcliff in some ways, in the same way. But eventually Cathy is able to see past that. She sees past the appearance of Hareton, and she's ultimately able to see him for who he is, which is a good person. Ultimately, I think that Cathy is an example of civilization embracing nature, rather than running away from it or hiding from it, which is what the previous generation of Lintons did. Edgar is ultimately a bit of a coward who hides from these things, and Isabella, although she had her moment where she confronted it and won, ultimately ran away from it and hid. Cathy does neither of these things. She embraces it head on, but she doesn't let it dominate her either. Ultimately then, just as Hareton is what Catherine and Heathcliff could have been if they were a bit more temperate, likewise Cathy is an example of what Isabella and Edgar could have been had they been a bit more compassionate and understanding. Part 3, Linton. Okay, so Linton is a character who, in my opinion, is the worst character in Wuthering Heights. He's not someone to be completely not empathised with, because he does, I guess, have quite a tragic story, but he's just so hateable and annoying and manipulative and disgusting that it is kind of hard for me to empathise with him in a way that I can with some of the other characters. But I'll do my best. Linton is meant to be Heathcliff's son, but physically looks nothing like Heathcliff. Heathcliff is strong and powerful in his manner and his expression, whereas Linton is weak, insipid, and ill. Heathcliff is capable of using violence and aggression to get what he wants, whereas Linton is only capable of using emotional blackmail and manipulation and any other sneaky, sly technique that he can use to get his way with people. Despite these physical differences though, Linton and Heathcliff are very similar in their general outlook on life. Both of them are selfish, both of them are vengeful, and this leads to both of their downfalls as well. For Linton, it's his willingness to listen to Heathcliff's toxic words that turn him against Cathy, and his refusal to listen to Cathy and to see her for the good person that she is, that ultimately leads to his death. I've heard some criticism that suggests that Linton's physical appearance is meant to embody what Heathcliff's personality has become. Just this weak husk of a human being who's completely twisted and distorted by their need for vengeance and their inability to empathise or feel. What's also interesting about Linton is that he seems in a way to almost undermine Heathcliff's masculinity. Heathcliff is often described as this incredibly virile, strong, powerful force, and yet the son that he produces is the exact opposite of this. Another explanation that's also quite symbolic could be that Heathcliff, who is so obsessed with the need for revenge, is unwilling to share any of his power with a future generation, and so when he does, what you get is just a weak, pathetic human being. This unwillingness to share his power is also reflected in the way that Heathcliff treats Linton, essentially just abandoning the poor boy to his own death. And that's one thing that I do empathise with Linton for, because that is a really tragic end, that his own father just basically lets him die. Linton could also represent an even more extreme version of naivety that we see in Cathy. Cathy at least grows up in the world of Wuthering Heights. She never sees the place until she's 13, but she is there. She is in the realm of the story. Whereas Linton is brought up by Isabella, who escapes that world entirely. And this is the product of that upbringing. Linton is completely incapable of dealing with anything because he's just not prepared for it. He's been so sheltered that when he comes into contact with the world of Wuthering Heights, he's no match for it at all. Not only is he weak and sick, but he's easily manipulated by Heathcliff, and once his purpose is served, he just dies. He's probably the ultimate victim in the story in that sense. He doesn't really get anything that he wants in the story. He arrives, he's abused, he's used, and then that's that. And for that reason, I do think it is important to empathise with Linton, even if he is a very annoying character, because he really is a victim. In fact, on rereads, I found myself quite moved by the part of the story when Linton, so he originally arrives to live with Edgar. Heathcliff finds out and demands that his son come and live with him, and Nellie takes Linton to Wuthering Heights, and she closes the door on Linton, and then she hears him screaming, I think, and banging on the door. And you never know what happens there, but it's implied, and it's just quite harrowing and one of the darkest scenes of the book, because you just know that now this boy is going to be suffering so much abuse and so much tyranny by Heathcliff and Joseph, and probably Hareton too, that it's just awful and terrifying. You know, it's almost like leaving a baby with a lion or something. Also, one thing that I will also say is that Nellie's narration of Linton is definitely biased, because she really doesn't like Linton at all. Probably she hates him more than she hates Catherine, so always bear that in mind when you're reading Nellie's narration. Part 4, conclusion. In this video then, we've analysed the second generation. We've looked at Cathy, we've looked at Hareton, and we've looked at Linton. I've argued that all of them relate to the previous generation in slightly different ways. Hareton is an example of what Catherine and Heathcliff might have been had they been able to control their wild and primitive impulses. Cathy is an example of what Isabella and Edgar could have been had they been able to confront and make peace with their more primitive sides and not either run away from it or hide from it. Linton is a bit harder to pin down, but ultimately I think he is a physical manifestation of Heathcliff's bitterness, and he's an extreme example of what happens when you shelter someone away from anything that might be harmful to them. Alright, that's it for today's video. Please let me know what you think of the second generation characters in the comments. I know that oftentimes people describe the second half of Wuthering Heights as not being as good as the first part, so I'd definitely like to know your thoughts on that as well. As always, I look forward to discussing all that with you in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to my channel. I post new videos on Mondays and Thursdays every week. But that's it for this video. Take care everyone. Ta-ra!